I did my PhD in the School of Architecture and Design. My supervisors were Richard Blythe and Marcelo Stam. The model that I did my PhD under was a reflective practice model, as some of you may be aware. And crudely speaking, the model of that is the subject matter of the PhD is my own creative practice. It's a bit like taking your creative practice to therapy, effectively. I have, in describing that model to people in other academic institutions, I've had people say things to me like, it's polite to wait for others to do a PhD on you. So it's, in some contexts, the idea that reflective practice and design itself can be the subject matter for a PhD is contentious in some contexts, and also within this school as well. Some people will describe it as, other architects usually, as not a proper PhD. The reason it gets assigned those monikers is that the premise that underpins the reflective practice PhD model that I did is that design itself is in fact an act of research. It sounds, well, usually sounds quite radical to architects when I speak to architects. I'm an architect, by the way. And the reason it does sound radical to architects is that traditionally speaking, architectural PhDs have been, you do research in a thing, like, you know, air volumes in buildings or a new type of facade or some sort of technical thing, and then once you've done the research, you then take that and apply it to design. However, if you look at the way that research is done in the scientific community, where research experiments start with a hunch and you go, well, maybe this could be a thing, and then around that you design an experiment, and then, or a number of experiments, and then you conduct those experiments, and then through observing those experiments, you come to some sort of conclusion and also adjust your initial hunch and then redo them based on that adjustment. That's sort of what happens when you design things. When you design something, you start by going, yeah, this could work, and then you try it, and in trying it, you're juggling through this whole array of sets of things, referring back to what is described as your community of practice, or which is another word for literature review, really, and tying into a whole lot of other things around it that are directly or indirectly related to what you're doing, and then you readjust the research question or the nature of the hunch, and then you apply that again and you go through that a number of times. And so in terms of how the scientific community understands research, it is very easy to understand that the act of design itself is in fact research. So within this description of how design is research, the model that I did my PhD under is how most of the people that are architects in A&D do their reflective practice PhDs. So it's a fairly standardised model. The contentiousness of it that I described comes mainly from outside of the institution. There are a couple of people within the institution, one in particular who recently left, who was adamant that this was not a proper PhD and insisted that his candidates did proper PhDs, where they did research before they did design things. He subsequently left and also was an unusual character because he himself didn't have a PhD. And so, again, it's this idea that you should be constrained to something that is determined by some other conservative thing as a way of protecting yourself, which is why he took that position, probably. So let me tell you what my practice is, briefly, so that you can understand why I thought it was worthwhile undertaking a reflective practice PhD. And then I'll take you on a bit of a journey through what it involved, and I'll try and give you some pointers along the way, which is also known as hoping that you can learn from my mistakes. I'm a practicing architect. I'm a member of a company that has another director, and I've been in that company since 2006. Before that, I worked for another company for 9 years. While I was working for that other company, I did a whole series of public artworks on my own. I have also taught architecture for my entire practicing career. I also sit on advocacy boards in the arts for things like the Creative Spaces Working Group for the City of Melbourne and the Mildura Palimpsest Biennale, and I was on the board of Gertrude Street Contemporary Art Spaces for a number of years, etc. There are a lot of things going on. The work the work itself, if you look at the things that I've designed and had impacts on in various ways, no single one of them seems to belong to a group of things. I've designed pieces of furniture, I've designed commercial office buildings, I've designed small house extensions, public artworks, collaborations with artists, collaborations with other architects. There isn't a single thing that seems consistent. And the work itself, before I did my PhD, people will say to me, describe your work to me, potential client, describe your work. And I'd say, I'm interested in things that are kind of wrong and ugly. And they go, okay, well, maybe we'll get another architect. So part of the benefits of doing a PhD was to come to a point where I was actually able to articulate the nature of my work without telling people that it was, ugly and wrong, which is sort of a bad way of summarising what I was interested in. So I undertook the PhD with the plan in mind to collect together this array of discombobulated projects which had no rhyme or reason, and no two projects belonged in the same category. And the plan was to stop doing that, to stop behaving like a badly aimed shotgun, and to work out a clear, neat way in which to conduct my creative practice, to find the thread or the DNA that ran through the middle of all of it and cast the unwanted things aside. And so the PhD question that I first framed was my initial guess at how to streamline and edit and cull and remove all this extraneousness and find the core. And in the first presentation that I made, I presented this array of different types of things and just said, well, that's all very good, but we're going to forget about that now because it's a bit of a mess, really. And the question that came up, well, where do you think this core is? And my attempts to define it were naive at best. And so there was this sort of awkward discussion and presentation, and my attempts to articulate it, I was just making stuff up, really. There was, by actually looking at what was there, I couldn't really see anything. And so from that absence, I guess, one of the panel members very excitedly said, actually the thing itself that is of interest is in fact the discombobulated, entangled, uncategorizable mess of your practice. That is the thing that is interesting. And so from that moment on, instead of trying to exclude things, I started trying to include things. I went and looked even further. When I first started my PhD, there were whole sections of my practice which I didn't even talk about because I thought, well, that's not relevant. So the advocacy stuff, governance on arts boards, my teaching, I sort of put them aside. I pulled about some bits of furniture and buildings that I designed. But instead, I actually started to drag it all in. So that's the important, if you're doing a reflective practice PhD, the first important thing to do is to try and have a completely objective look at what it is that's in front of you before you make any decisions about what it is that you think that you're actually doing, which is just to stand back and say, well, actually, what is it? What's there? And try and look at it all. So my first few presentations, which were presented through the practice research seminars, which happen twice every year, were just huge wallpapers of stuff on the wall, putting it all up and looking at it. And to get it all up there and to look at it, I had to sort of collect it and put it in a little portfolio. And from the very beginning, I started putting my presentations together as if they were a giant book. And on the wall, I just spilled out pages and pages of that book. It was very difficult to actually see all of the stuff on my computer screen or even print it out. It was only really once that they got them all up on the wall. And I didn't do any PowerPoint presentations for my entire PhD, except for one exception, I think. It was always this wallpaper wall, and I'd put it up, decide what I was going to talk about, go down to the practice research seminar, I'd stand there and look at it and see it all, and then I'd have the script in my hand, and it never matched, because seeing it suddenly made me realise other things about it. So the process of the practice research seminars was a very important part of reflecting on what it is that I was doing. The other part of the model is that it's not simply a matter of reflecting on your practice, but what the model is particularly interested in is how the process of reflection changes the way that you actually work. So once you've come to an understanding, tentative though it may be, how does that understanding of what you now do affect the way that you work? Which is a beautiful thing for a university to be able to say, by doing this process, your work has changed, and that's primarily what the university is interested in capturing from your practice. But boy, is it a headfuck. It really is. I found this quote by Brian Eno, who doesn't know who Brian Eno is? Okay, good. I asked my students that, and they go, who? So Brian Eno is an amazingly prolifically creative person, and almost everything that he produces is kind of different. So I did a lot of reading on his theories of creativities, and I found a quote which I could never find again. It isn't in my PhD. So this is one tip: if you find something that's good, fucking write it down. But the quote is, even if you don't immediately think it's interesting, just try and keep records of every little snippet of thing that you find. But the quote from Brian Eno is basically, while engaged in a creative process, never think about the nature of the creative process. They are two completely separate exercises. So it's Brian Eno basically saying this reflective practice PhD model will drive you insane, and it almost did, because you're trying to be yourself and observe yourself at the same time. But it was difficult, and it is actually possible to do, and I managed to find my way through that. So effectively, what I did in looking at the way that I worked is I essentially interrogated a whole range of different types of things. Some of the projects that I design are me with a piece of paper and a pen drawing something, and that then becoming an object which gets built and designed, which is how you might expect a designer to work. But some of the projects that I'm involved in, I'm one part of a very large collaboration of people, and in some instances, I'm not the primary designer of that particular person. I have an ambient relationship to what's going on. I might be there in a managerial capacity. And so on some projects, which have my name against them because they come out of my practice, my primary design tool is email or Gantt charts. And so the PhD looked at the way that the language that is used and the process of management actually inform the outcome of design. So that meant that things that were like business management of my practice, that is actually also another design tool. So I was trying to stand back and look at the different ways that designers actually impact. Every design practice has people that are designers and people that are contract managers, and you can't really have one without the other. You can't separate them out into someone being a designer and someone actually just being the person that manages the business. Without the two, both having an interest in design, then the thing actually falls apart as a whole, because these are systemically collaborative processes. If you're designing anything that's bigger than a chair, even a chair, it was going to involve multiple people. So I was also trying to unpack the idea that the designer is an individual. So I've tried to take a step back in my PhD and talk. So the community of practice in my PhD then started to play a very important role, and I took quite a broad understanding to community of practice and literature review. I included in my community of practice photographs of buildings that I liked, or people that were doing similar things to what I thought I was doing that I was vaguely aware of, but weren't necessarily engaging with in a direct way. There were people that were heroes, people that were advisors, people whose work I explicitly referenced and followed and developed. So that was about understanding relationships and lineages and the process of how, when I design, I'm actually thinking about and existing within a community of people, and those communities have multiple and overlapping layers. The Reflective Practice PhD includes a series of projects. So this book here, which ended up getting produced, has a community practice, an introduction, an essay, 11 projects, a conclusion and an acknowledgement. It's a fairly standard format. The A&D prefer that you have about 20,000 words. They prefer it to be word light. And I'm a terrible writer. I was convinced I was a terrible writer, and also that I was going to really struggle with the writing. And that was in part to do with the fact that my father's a writer, and I grew up around him writing, and he's a freak. He does these little diagrams. He goes, it's a diagram, literally takes him about half an hour, and it's a diagram of all the things that he thinks he wants to write about in a book. And then he puts the diagram there and he goes, right. And he won't talk to it, and he just goes like this. And then the book's done. So I thought, well, that's how you write. And so I tried that. Just did the diagram, and then I went, oh shit, that doesn't work. Oh, that doesn't sound good. And I can't write. I do not have the innate ability that is required in order to be a writer. And through this process, I learned how to write. I learned that, in fact, except for my dad, no one's a freak. Writing is actually work, and that if you put your effort into it, then it actually becomes quite easy. So I came across a few very helpful truisms when I was trying to learn how to escape from the assumption that writing was somehow an innate ability. Hemingway's was my favourites, which was write when you're drunk and edit when you're sober, which was extremely helpful. It fitted in with my social life quite well. No, in all earnestness, the reason that was helpful is that that allowed me to start a process where I simply wrote narrative stories about my projects, and those narrative stories are the project sections of the book that I produced. But I wrote them without worrying what was in them. I just said, blah, 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 blah. This happened, that happened, this happened, that happened, this happened, that happened. And so the process of actually writing itself was the reflection. That was a very important shift for me. The process of writing was the act of reflection. Beforehand, I'd imagined that reflection was something that... And then you write it in your mind. Once you've written, okay, I've written, now I'm going to type it up. But that's really not how it worked. And because of that, I really delayed starting the writing of the PhD. It wasn't until I was really 5 years into a 6-year PhD, and after a number of rather stern emails from supervisors and other members in RMIT, I started actually writing, and then started really reflecting on it, and then wished I'd started writing earlier. I really did. There's something else I wanted to say about that. Through writing each of the project pieces, I then ended up with this narrative collection of stories about the work. And I then started to go through those, not to edit them in the first instance, but to read through them and pick pieces out of them to construct basically the introduction, and to construct the essay, which was the bulk of the practice, the bulk of the PhD, sorry, and also to write the conclusion and contributions to knowledge at the end, which are always a much smaller part than you think they're actually going to be. It feels like it's what you're there to do, but there's this beautiful diagram that I've seen, which is it's this big circle which goes like that, which is all the knowledge in the world, and there's a tiny bump on the end, which is the bit you're adding by contributing to knowledge. So by becoming an expert in your field, by properly understanding your community of practice or literature review, by thoroughly examining your own work and the way that you practice, which is what you would be examining if you were doing a collective practice PhD, you come to an understanding that, well, everyone else has got anyway, but it's a very broad understanding. And then you add a little bit on the end. And that little bit is the bit that the university wants to claim belongs to it, which is fine by me. So I identified 9 different ways of designing, and as I mentioned earlier, they're all completely different and sort of related to each other, but not really. But in order to present them, I had to place them in a neat order so that I could talk about them. But I went out of my way to say that in unpacking them and ordering them in numbers 1 to 9 was only done for the purpose of communicating the understanding that I had come to my practice. And that in order for the practice to continue, they needed to be re-entangled in order for me to be able to continue to function. And so, I don't know if you're aware or not, but part of the reflective practice PhD model is that you produce an exhibition, and the choreography of your exhibition, which you have to prepare when your document is submitted for examination, which is a number of months before the exhibition itself. The choreography or the design of the exhibition has to go in the document, and then the exhibition itself also forms part of the durable visual record, or whatever it is called now. So this here, and also a video of me presenting in my exhibition, are the PhD. This is not supposed to stand on its own. It's those two things together. And to the extent that it is possible, you're encouraged to extend the work that you're doing when you present in your exhibition. But that's a very subtle, politically tricky thing to do, because you also have to foreshadow how it will be extended in the document so that your examiners don't think you're adding extra material which can trip you up when it comes to the examination process. The examiners that I had were 2 people who practiced in the visual arts, Peter McNeil and Peter Adset. And before I talk about them, I will talk about the editing and proofing process. Pay an editor, find some money, pay an editor. It's incredibly invaluable. You'll probably find that you can apply for a grant from the school to pay an editor, which is what I did, and pay a proofreader, and they are not the same person. They are 2 different people. If you're going to produce a graphically designed document like I did, which you may or may not want to do, and in fact I would advise against it, then pay a designer to set up the graphic outline for you as well. And the graphic designer and the editor and the proofreader are not the same person. They're 3 different people. I know that because I had them all as the same person. And they were trying to design the book and edit it and proof it at the same time, which they did an astoundingly good job at, given the time pressure that I put them under. The result of which was that when this was submitted and it went through without amendment, which was a huge sigh of relief to everyone involved, especially the designer / editor / proofreader who was making final design / editing / proofing changes 2 hours before it was submitted. He said, "I've never done anything like this before in my life." He was an editor who has a lot of practice editing PhDs, but in a different field, and that's actually very important, so that the silly lingo that we invent in our own field gets unpacked. It went through without amendment, and then sometime after it was all over, I produced a copy of this for my mother to read because she wanted one. And she gave it back to me 2 weeks later, filled with red notes, saying it's filled with typographical and grammatical errors, which it was indeed, which I've now corrected, but the examiners didn't notice. They were just, and before you accuse them of not actually reading it, wrote very extensive feedback on it. And I know that's probably just damn good luck. I think they were just so enthusiastic about, all the pretty pictures and the nature of the content of the writing that they didn't stop to notice the extensive grammatical and typographical errors. But I have heard stories of people having examiners who find every single error in there and won't let you go until they've proven to you that their grammar is better than yours. So I wouldn't encourage anyone to rely on that, but you might just get lucky. I designed this as a book so that I can shoot it off straight to get published as soon as it's been through the process. That placed an enormous burden upon me because I was trying to do two things at once. I was trying to think about the audience of the book and the examiners, and that created a bunch of constraints which I wish that I hadn't had. I have heard subsequently that some supervisors encourage people to submit their PhD in a single-sided A4 PDF, because it's now electronic submission, double-spaced, and then a separate file with images and absolutely no graphic content at all. So that the work that's being examined is just the written word, the images, the diagrams. Now, obviously, different supervisors have different views on that. But if I'd done that, it would have actually, this would be it would be a much better document than it is. I haven't published this since I finished it. It's become a sort of funny, grumbling thing in the background, because one of the truisms that I was fed to me, which was a very helpful one as well, which was a PhD is a sonnet, not a tome. It's just a project, along with all of your other many, many projects. So get it done, get it out, move on to the next one. And that is extremely helpful. But it also means that the things that I learned from this and the projects I've done subsequently have taken my work off in other directions. This isn't the end of a bunch of reflection, it's the beginning of a bunch of reflection. And so I now feel that this is completely out of date a year later. And so I'm kind of reluctant to publish it. But, I'm going to do it, just as a historical document. I think that's probably all that I want to say.